All right, guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we're going to talk about another engine. You guys really enjoyed these technical training videos, so this time we're going to take a step back and talk about the S55. I know this is something we haven't talked a lot about. It used to be kind of like the main contender and things that people would compare with the B58, but the S58 kind of came in and completely swept the field, so that kind of became our new argument, and we've had fun swinging at each other over there. But the S55 is still an amazing engine. It's getting into a chassis that is probably one of the better value platforms right now. And I think there are a lot of great things about it. But of course, there are a couple things that are a significant headache that make a lot of people want to avoid this engine. So in this video, we'll talk about all of the things that we know about it. As always, I'll have a link to the technical training in the video description if you guys want to read through it yourself. It's a little bit over 100 pages, I believe, but we'll try to condense all of that in this video. So hopefully you guys find it useful. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. Now, for those of you that remember when the S55 came out, you know it was a really big deal. This was a very notable shift for BMW because this was the first time that they were going to release an M3 with a turbo engine. So historically, of course, it was always inline engines. They went from an inline 4 to an inline 6. And then in the E90 and E92, they put the V8 in it, which people freaked out at first, but it sounded good and the engine was still pretty light, so they kind of let it slide. But when this turbo engine came out, it was another one of those cases where a new M series car comes and everybody hates it. A lot of people were completely against boosting these engines. But over time, of course, a lot of us have moved on from that. It's kind of become the standard of what we expect, and it really helped pioneer a lot of the things that we see today. Now, the S55 is kind of based on the N55, which we can definitely talk about in a future video if you guys are interested, but it builds upon that platform and turns it into an engine that's, capable of doing things you would want your M3 to do. The first one, of course, is making more power, and these cars are rated for anywhere from 405 horsepower all the way up to 493 horsepower, and anywhere from 406 foot-pounds of torque all the way up to 443. Now, a lot of this is pretty much just tuning. BMW releases them in several different vehicles. Originally, we just had the M3 and M4. Then eventually they came out with like the CS and GTS versions. And then eventually it made its way into the M2 as well, which was originally released with an N55, but then they came out with the M2 Comp and kind of sold it as an upgrade that now has the twin turbo S55 engine. Now, in reality, of course, they couldn't sell it with the N55 anymore due to emissions requirements in Europe, and they still detuned it so that the M2 wouldn't be too much faster than the M3 and M4, but at least they put the same engine in the smaller chassis. Now, they say about 75% of the components are the same as the N55, but I would argue that majority of those components are adapted for the S55 in the way that they put it. So there are certain things that are specific to having an engine that's twin turbo, having twin intakes, an air-to-water intercooler and all of these things. And so they made the components adapt for that. So it's kind of the overall shape and design of an N55, but still very specific to the S55 engine. They also noted that it's 3% lighter than the N55, which you'll see as a common theme here because when the F80 and F82 M3 and M4 came out, this was kind of their study on making a car lighter. I don't know why they have apparently completely avoided that concept with their M series cars, but at the time it was extremely innovative that they were releasing a new engine that was bigger and wider, but also lighter than its predecessor. So a lot of good things came from this weight reduction. Now, the engine code is S55B30T0, and this engine came from BMW with an aluminum closed deck block. Now, this is different from the N55, which was open deck, and so that came with a couple other changes. The N55 had iron sleeves to help strengthen it, and since the S55 was closed deck, it didn't need that, and instead they implemented a coating on the cylinder walls so that would reduce friction, reduce drivetrain losses, and help the engine run more efficiently. It also has a forged steel lightweight crankshaft, as well as aluminum alloy pistons made by Mahle, and it also implements Valvetronic and Vanos. Now, if you have a B58 or S58, it's not going to be the exact same. It's actually the previous generation of this technology. So you'll see that the Valvetronic motor is actually mounted basically on top of the cylinder head in between the intake and exhaust valves. And you'll also see that the Vanos solenoids are completely separate from the actual cam. So they have these two separate solenoids that are mounted and installed on the side of the engine in the path of oil flow. And that's what kind of controlled how much oil went to the cams to manage your cam timing. So that's kind of how those things worked. Even though the overall idea is still the same, it still implemented variable valve timing as well as variable valve lift, but it's just a slightly slower, slightly less efficient, slightly less reliable version of what we have in modern engines. Now, of course, a big upgrade here was the oil system. A lot of you guys that have been paying attention to the N55 boards know that a big issue with it is oil starvation. If you take an N55 powered BMW to the track, it's very likely that you could run into an issue where you starve the engine of oil and cause a rod bearing failure, or even worse, that can damage your engine. So BMW addressed that in the S55 by upgrading the oiling system with 2 oil pumps. It has one main oil pump as well as an auxiliary pump that pulls oil from the front of the engine towards the rear of the engine so that it's by the main pickup. And that helps make sure that the car can handle over 1G when going through turns without causing oil starvation issues. The oil pump itself also flows 18% more oil, so it's much better at pushing oil through the system and making sure that everything stays lubricated. And they also have a separate oil cooler, which is mounted underneath the engine, so keep that in mind. A lot of people are concerned about that because it's pretty risky. Where it's mounted is in the under tray, so potentially if you run over a rock or something like that, it could damage it and cause oil to leak out. But from a cooling standpoint, it works really well. The core is really big, and it's a good place to get a lot of passive airflow that otherwise you wouldn't be using. They also implemented a magnesium oil pan, so this helped further reduce the weight of the engine. And it also has additional baffles, again, to help just manage the oil and keep all of it around the pickup as much as possible. So a lot of things to help make sure that the M3 with the S55 engine would be capable to run track days without any issues. This car does have an aluminum oil filter housing, which was kind of the standard for BMW engines in the past. Now on the B58, of course, we know it has a plastic housing, but it still had the old design where the oil filter housing was mounted right up front and it was made out of aluminum. A lot of times those gaskets would fail over time, but at least the housing itself, you wouldn't have to worry about cracks and stuff like that. And then from the PCV standpoint, everything is built into the valve cover. Again, very typical for BMW engines. Really, I've only seen the Gen 1 as something that you can kind of service and replace individual diaphragms. On the S55, if you have a PCV issue, you're pulling the whole valve cover off and replacing the entire assembly. Now, one nice thing that BMW did inside the crankcase is add additional baffles so that oil would stay down in the oil pan and prevent it from kind of getting up and hitting the crank and causing it to slosh around. This can cause drivetrain losses as well as other issues, so it just does a better job of managing the oil inside of your crankcase. Now, as far as airflow, everything starts off going through the intakes. And I think it's kind of interesting because if you look at the F-Series BMWs with the N55, you look at the engine bay and see the intake on the right. With the B58, you see the intake on the left. And then with the S55, it's got both. So they did a really good job of packaging things so that it could work with both engine variants as they released these updates and LCI models. Everything was just kind of an iteration of what was already existing for our intake path. Also, the intakes are cold air intakes because they are pulling cool air from the front grille area on the left and right side. So definitely recommend, if you are going to be upgrading your intake, try to maintain that design strategy where it's pulling air from the front of the car and not just leaving open filters in the engine bay that could potentially lose horsepower. Now, after that, it goes through the twin turbos, which again, you've got 2 of them, one on the first 3 banks, one on the second 3 banks. Both of them are single scroll turbos with an electronic wastegate, no diverter valve or blow-off valve needed. All of the excess airflow is managed by your Vanos system. And then coming out of it, it goes through 2 charge pipes into an air-to-water intercooler. And this was another big one because it's the first time we've seen an air-to-water intercooler. on these, inline six turbo engines, and BMW went really hard with this one. I'll say a lot of people have tracked their cars, done multiple laps, doing 20, 30-minute sessions, and they find that the intercooler basically is room temperature. It's really hard to get it overheated. So it's something that works really well, especially with all the extra auxiliary coolers and stuff they have in front of the car. It seems like a really robust setup. The biggest downside I've seen people experience the intercooler cracking, which can cause coolant to flow into your intake, which obviously is bad. It can cause misfires, or in a worst case scenario, potentially hydrolock your engine. So if you are having misfire issues or any problems, definitely make sure that coolant isn't leaking into your charge pipe and going into your engine, because that can cause a world of pain down the road. Now, on top of that, BMW also implemented water injection on the GTS model. And this is kind of the highest horsepower S55 you can get from the factory. And what they did was add the water injection to further cool off the intake air, and that made the air more dense, which allowed you to make more power. So this is kind of the same thing I've been talking about in the past when people ask me about meth injection, and I explain that you don't really spray meth injection for cooling, you spray it for octane, and if you want cooling, then you spray water. That's exactly what BMW did in the GTS. They've got nozzles inside of the intake manifold that will spray and cool down the intake air before it gets into the engine. Also, I am disappointed that I haven't heard of anybody using it for meth. Although these GTS models are so rare and expensive, I don't know a lot of people that are even modifying them, but it seems like such an easy option. If you wanted to add meth, you would have it factory controlled. Spraying when you're in boost already probably can be controlled by the DME in your tune, but I'll leave it at that. And speaking of which, let's go ahead and talk about the fueling. And so the S55 is a direct injection engine. There is no actual port injection. It has very similar injectors to the N55, but one thing it does upgrade from it is it has dual high pressure fuel pumps. So kind of like the S58 has two B58 high pressure fuel pumps, the S55 has two N55 high pressure fuel pumps. But instead of mounting it on top of the engine running off of the exhaust cam, it is actually running off the vacuum pump. There is a drive shaft that drives the two high pressure fuel pumps basically just to the side of the S55 engine. So it's kind of a unique setup. It was kind of the growing pains of BMW figuring out how to make a high pressure fuel system work. It was a little bit better than what you saw on the N54, but I definitely think mounting it on top of the engine on the B58 and S58 is the best place to put it. Now, the way that it works on the factory tuning is one pump is working below 3,000 RPM, and then the second pump comes on above 3,000 RPM, so kind of like a staged approach. Obviously, with an aftermarket tune, you can use both of them whenever you need to, but this is a big part of the reason why these cars can make so much power with a stock fuel system. You basically have twice the high pressure fuel capacity through the pumps themselves compared to a factory N55 car. It also has a low pressure fuel system sensor, which again is really nice to have. BMW kind of went backwards on the B58 and took it away and tried to model everything in the tune, but it's not really that accurate. And so it's nice to see at least they had it on the S55 where you can monitor actual fuel pressure and put safeties around it in case you're pushing the limits of your fuel system. Now let's talk about the big downsides, which you probably won't see this in the technical training, but one big one that we always talk about is how the S55 sounds. It is a horrible sounding engine. Pretty much everybody that doesn't drive one knows that it sounds really bad. Of course, owners behind the wheel, somehow they completely can't hear how bad it sounds anymore. But I've said before, because it's like twin turbo, it basically sounds like two 3-cylinder Hondas racing down the highway. It's really disappointing because BMW has a way of doing this with a lot of their M engines. The S54 was the same, and I think a lot of it has to do with the valve train as well. I know everybody focuses on equal length mid pipes and all of this stuff, but none of it really fixes the noise. It seems like a lot of it comes down to what BMW does in the valve train to allow these engines to rev higher. And so for whatever reason, the way that they have them kind of high strung, it just sounds really, really bad. The only thing I think that really fixes the S55 sound is moving to a single turbo setup, which in that case, it sounds really good. The other thing is the dreaded crank hub issue. And for those of you that aren't familiar, the crank hub is basically two pieces, and those two pieces are not permanently fixed together or not even keyed. So there are certain instances where, especially with DCT cars, if you downshift and hit high torque instantly, it can basically cause the crank hub to spin and it puts the engine out of time. So that is obviously a really big issue. You need your crank to spin at the same time as your valves in order to avoid contact with your valves and your pistons. So if that spins and the crank is off time from the cams, you can definitely cause some damage. Best case scenario, it just causes some misfires, but there's no actual contact. Worst case scenario, things get smashed inside of the cylinders and you have to replace or rebuild your engine. So this is something that fortunately has multiple solutions out there. Please don't ask me which one is best. I won't be able to give you a good answer. Everybody that has one seems to think that it works perfectly, but not many people try multiple solutions. So I would just say make sure you find something that has good positive engagement and something that will make sure that the crank hub can't actually spin separately from the crank itself, and you should be able to solve that issue. Now, of course, it is a pretty involved process to install and it's pretty expensive. So for a lot of people like me, that's enough to make us avoid the S55 entirely. But besides all of that, I still think that the S55 is a great engine. It's something that I think kind of led to a lot of the development we have today. And I honestly do believe that the S58 is a combination of the S55 and B58 put together. Kind of like the name suggests, they took a lot of learnings from both motors to create the S58 that's in the current M3 and M4. So unfortunately, it doesn't get a lot of love primarily because of the crank hub issue, but it is something that has done great things and will continue to make great power in the future. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you guys for watching and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.